This is the second part of chapter 8, section 2, and we're still discussing the Greek philosophers. Now, the third philosopher that we're discussing in this lesson is Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wrote more than 200 works, unlike, of course, Socrates and Plato. He wrote on very different topics, such as government, astronomy, and political science. Now, in 335 BC, Aristotle created a school called the Lyceum. At this school, he taught his students the concept or the idea of the golden mean. As you all know, mathematically, mean is the middle number, or it's the middle value between two extremes. Now, the idea of golden mean is that people should live moderately. They should not be too good, they should not be too bad, but you should live a moderate life. And this should be applied on all aspects of individuals, which means that, for example, you should not eat very little and you should not eat too much. Mean is always the best. So this was the idea of um, Aristotle, which was called the golden mean. Now, Aristotle had also many interests, which included science. He studied the stars, plants, and animals carefully and recorded his observations. The first classification to be done was made by Aristotle, where he classified the living things according to their similarities and differences. Aristotle's methods were also important because these steps developed later on to the basis of astronomy, uh, uh, science of plants, animals, and the human body. Now, like Plato, Aristotle also talked about the government. Um, He studied and compared the governments of different city-states in Greece, and he hoped to find the best political system. He wrote a book called The Politics, where he divided the government into three types. The first type of government was known as monarchy, which is ruled by one person. Uh, The second type was oligarchy, which is ruled by a few people, and the third type was democracy, which is ruled by many people uh, voting for their representative. We discussed these three types previously when we talked about the governments of Athens and Sparta. Now, Aristotle believed that the best government should have the features of all of the three. It should have a strong representative, like a monarch. It should be ruled by a few people, and these people are representatives of the rest of the society democratically by their own will. So, according to Aristotle, the best type of government was the one that combined monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. Now, Aristotle's ideas influenced the way Europeans and Americans thought about their government. And this is why the authors of the Constitution of the United States used his ideas of democracy and no absolute power. Now, you need to go back to your book, please, and study this table on page 224, which differentiates between the four types or four philosophers that we discussed in the lesson. It differentiates between them. It discusses what were the main ideas that each and every one of them taught, what are their important contributions, and how did they influence their thinkings, how did the thinking influence us today. So this table on page 224 is very important because it has other information or summarizes the philosophers in a different way other than the things that we discussed in the book. Now, um, to move from philosophers to thinkers, the first thinker that we're going to talk about is Herodotus. He wrote the history of the Persian Wars. Herodotus also wrote that the gods played a role in most of the historical events, but he made a lot of effort to separate between facts and fictions. How did he do that? He reported all of his findings. He questioned the people to get the correct information, and this is why we consider Herodotus as the father of history. Another famous historian was called Thucydides. He was a general in the Peloponnesian War, and the two great city-states of Athens and Sparta fought this war, if you remember. Now, Thucydides considered that this war was a major event in the world history and that it changed the course of history. And he wrote a famous book known as The History of the Peloponnesian War. But unlike Herodotus, Thucydides rejected the idea that the gods affected human history. He believed that only people were the ones who made history and people were only responsible for the actions of peace and war. And he tried very hard also to prove his findings, which contradicted with Herodotus. He examined the documents, he went to the battle sites, and he only took his words from people who witnessed the events. This is why Thucydides is more accurate and more realistic in his book than Herodotus. Thucydides did not just state the facts, but he also explored the idea of cause and effect, which was the first time to be discussed during history, which is this event, what were the causes that led to this event, and how did this event affect the humans later on. He believed that the future generations should learn from the past. This is why we need to know how did everything start, or why, or what are the causes that, for example, caused certain wars, and how did it affect the human nature or society. So for now, we discussed philosophers, we discussed thinkers and writers, and moving to the last part of the lesson, which is the scientists. The ancient Greeks were the first people to develop these scientific ideas as well as the scientific methods. Now, the Greek scientists had many different ideas which they explored. They thought that the natural events should be explained logically and that people should discover this by reasoning. The first important Greek scientist was known as Thales. He studied astronomy and maths. He did not have a telescope or any other astronomical instrument at that time, but he only made his theories by observations and thinkings. Of course, this is not as precise as later on uh, uh, experiments and observations of the space. Now, another Greek scientist is Pythagoras, and of course, you should have known or heard the name from the Pythagorean theorem. He was a scientist which was mainly focused on mathematics, and he believed that all relationships could be expressed in numbers. He developed a lot of ideas about maths, and his famous contribution was the Pythagorean theorem that is still used in geometry up until today. This theorem is a way to determine the lengths of the sides of a triangle using a certain formula and a side called the hypotenuse. Now, the last scientist for our lesson today is Hippocrates. Hippocrates was a physician in ancient Greece who was regarded or was considered as the father of medicine. He believed that the diseases came from natural causes and that when people are sick, there has to be a reason for it. Most people at that time thought that people got sick because of evil spirits or because they were evil, so this was a punishment from the gods. But Hippocrates started studying medicine, started studying the different diagnoses of illness, and he discovered treatments to help cure sick people. Today, doctors use his oath, which is known as the Hippocratic Oath, that says that the doctors should do their best to help their patients. It also states that the doctor should protect the patient's privacy and follow up whatever observations or diagnosis to treat the patient. This was the end of the lesson. Please write your own notes. Divide the lesson into 3 categories: philosophers, writers, and scientists. In this way, it will be easier for you to divide the names in the lessons according to what they studied. If you have any questions, please let me know. And do not forget to go back to the table on page 224.